I didn't notice the extra weight in the car until I hit 80 miles per hour on the desolate stretch of I-90 and saw a pair of wide, unblinking eyes reflecting in my rearview mirror. The realization didn't hit me like a sudden shock, but rather like a slow, freezing realization that the shadow behind my headrest was moving independently of the car's vibration. It had been a grueling 12-hour drive through the heart of the Midwest, and the fatigue was starting to settle into my bones like lead, which is likely why I hadn't heard the back door click shut at that last derelict rest stop. I remember standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of the vending machine, clutching a lukewarm coffee while the wind howled through the rusted rafters, feeling a strange prickle on the back of my neck that I dismissed as mere exhaustion. Now, staring into that sliver of glass, I could see the faint outline of a man's forehead and those terrifyingly still eyes peering over the edge of my back seat. My journey had begun early that morning as a solo move across several states to start a new chapter of my life. I had packed my car with my most important belongings, hoping to reach my new home by dawn, but the endless miles of highway had turned the trip into a grueling marathon. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force that I felt the pulse in my fingertips against the steering wheel. Yet I knew I couldn't scream or slam on the brakes without giving him the opening he was waiting for. If I jerked the car, he might lung forward with whatever weapon he was surely holding. And at this speed, a struggle would mean certain death for both of us in a tangled wreck of metal. I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, trying to maintain a steady pressure on the gas pedal while my mind raced through every possible scenario of how he got in and, more importantly, what he intended to do to me once the sun went down. The highway was a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through endless fields of corn, and there wasn't a single headlight in sight to offer the comfort of another human soul. Every few seconds, I risked a microscopic glance at the mirror, noting that he hadn't moved an inch, just watching me with a predatory patience that suggested he had done this many times before. I wondered if he was waiting for me to pull over for gas, or perhaps he was waiting for the moment my eyes finally drifted shut from the sheer mental strain of the situation. The silence inside the cabin was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the tires and the occasional whistle of wind through the window seal, making the presence behind me feel even more oppressive. Why hadn't he moved yet? And what was the significance of the small, metallic clicking sound I began to hear coming from the darkness of the footwell? It sounded like the rhythmic flicking of a folding knife or perhaps the ticking of a stopwatch, a sound designed to erode my sanity and force me into making a desperate, fatal mistake. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like it was filled with dry sand, and I realized that my hands were shaking so violently that the car was beginning to drift toward the rumble strip. The moment the tires hit the notched pavement, the jarring vibration sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I saw the figure in the mirror sit up just a fraction higher. I corrected the steering immediately, forcing my voice to remain steady as I began to hum a low, mindless tune to mask the sound of my own panicked breathing. I needed a plan, a way to signal for help or a way to eject this predator from my sanctuary without ending up as a headline in a small-town newspaper. There was a police substation about 50 miles ahead, according to the GPS, but 50 miles felt like an eternity when a killer was breathing the same recycled air just inches from my neck. I started to wonder if he was watching the GPS screen too, calculating the distance and realizing that his window of opportunity was slowly closing as we approached more civilized territory. Suddenly, I felt a cold, thin object touch the back of my ear, and my entire body turned to ice as I realized it was the tip of a blade. A voice, raspy and dry like dead leaves rubbing together, whispered into the space between the seats, telling me to take the next exit or he would open my throat right there against the headrest. He told me he didn't want the car, he wanted the experience. A phrase that sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach as the true nature of his depravity became clear. I didn't answer him, mostly because I didn't think I could speak without sobbing, but I slowly moved my hand toward the center console where I kept a heavy, steel-cased flashlight. The exit sign for a town called Miller's Grove appeared in the distance, a place that looked like nothing more than on a map with no lights and no hope. As I began to slow the car down to navigate the off-ramp, I noticed that the man leaned forward, his face finally entering the dim glow of the dashboard lights, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his chin. He looked remarkably ordinary except for his eyes, which held a vacuum of empathy that made me realize begging would be a complete waste of breath. The ramp was long and curved, leading into a dark valley where the trees grew thick and close to the shoulder, providing the perfect cover for whatever he had planned for me. I kept my foot light on the brake, feeling his excitement rise as the car slowed to a crawl, his hand gripping the back of my seat so hard I could hear the leather groan. He told me to turn left into the woods, into a gravel turnout that was hidden from the main road by a dense thicket of overgrown brush. This was the moment of truth, the gap between life and a shallow grave, and I knew I had to act before the car came to a complete stop. Instead of turning left, I suddenly floored the accelerator while simultaneously jerking the steering wheel hard to the right toward a steep embankment. The sudden surge of power threw him backward, his head slamming against the rear window with a sickening thud that momentarily disoriented him. As the car bumped and bucked over the uneven terrain, I grabbed the steel flashlight and swung it blindly over my shoulder with every ounce of strength I possessed. I felt it connect with something soft and then something hard, followed by a howl of rage and pain that filled the small cabin of the car. I didn't stop to see if he was unconscious. I threw the car into park while it was still rolling and leaped out into the freezing night air, sprinting toward the distant glow of a farmhouse I had seen across the field. I could hear the car door behind me fly open and the sound of heavy boots hitting the gravel, followed by the frantic gasping of a man who was hurt but still very much a threat. I didn't look back, not even when I heard him screaming curses into the wind, because I knew that if I faltered for even a second, those eyes from the mirror would be the last thing I ever saw. I reached the farmhouse porch and pounded on the door with my bloody knuckles, screaming for help until the porch light flickered on and the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back signaled my salvation. The police found my car abandoned an hour later, the interior stained with blood that didn't belong to me, but the man with the scarred face had vanished into the cornfields like a ghost of the highway. I never drive at night anymore, and I never, ever get into my car without checking the floorboards and the back seat first. I have spent most of my life finding peace in the solitude of the open road, but that peace died the moment those twin spheres of blinding white light appeared in my rearview mirror on the crest of the Blackwood Mountain Pass. It started as a distant glimmer, a mere speck in the darkness of the fog-choked valley, but within minutes, this vehicle had surged forward, pinning itself to my rear bumper with a predatory precision that made my skin crawl. The high beams were so intense that they turned my entire cabin into a bleached, overexposed nightmare, reflecting off every polished surface and searing the image of my own terrified eyes into the glass of the windshield. I flicked my tab to dim the mirror, but the light bled around the edges, creating a halo of white fire that made it impossible to see the treacherous curves of the cliffside road ahead. I was driving a light sedan, a car built for city streets and fuel economy, while the beast behind me had the wide, aggressive stance of a heavy-duty truck, its engine a low, guttural growl that I could feel vibrating through my own floorboards. Why wouldn't he just pass me on the straightaways? There were dozens of opportunities where the double yellow lines vanished and the road opened up, yet every time I slowed down and signaled for him to go around, he simply braked with me, maintaining that suffocating 5-foot gap. It felt like he was tethered to my soul by a chain of light, mocking my attempts at civility while we climbed higher into the thin, freezing air of the peaks. The fog began to thicken, swirling like ghosts in the beams of my headlights, and I realized that I was driving blind, guided only by the faint white lines of the shoulder and the sheer terror of what would happen if I touched the brakes too hard. I began to wonder if this was a game to him, a sick sport played by a local who knew every dip and camber of these mountains, while I was a stranger stumbling through the dark. My hands were cramping from gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles white and bloodless, as I pushed the car to 60, then 70 miles per hour on stretches that were meant for 40. Every time I accelerated, the truck behind me matched my speed instantly, the roar of its oversized tires echoing off the rock walls like the baying of a hound. I tried to look for a face, a silhouette, anything to humanize the threat, but the glare was a solid wall of radiation that shielded the driver from view. Was he drunk, or was this something far more calculated? The way he adjusted his position to block my view every time I checked my side mirrors suggested a level of malice that went beyond mere road rage. He wanted me to crash. He wanted to watch me lose control and tumble into the black abyss that waited beyond the crumbling guardrails. The higher we climbed, the more the isolation began to feel like a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of my car until I felt like I was being crushed. There were no houses here, no gas stations, and my cell phone had lost its signal miles ago, leaving me alone with a mechanical monster that seemed to have no destination other than my own demise. I reached a series of sharp hairpins, the kind of turns that required full concentration and steady braking, but the truck didn't slow down. Instead, he flicked his lights from high to low and back again in a rhythmic, strobing pattern, a psychological tactic designed to trigger a panic attack or a seizure. My vision began to swim, the world tilting on its axis as the flashing lights played tricks on my depth perception, making the road look like it was folding in on itself. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the empty car, my voice cracking with a desperation that terrified me more than the truck did. I realized then that I couldn't keep this up for another hour. The mountain was too long and my nerves were too frayed. I saw a sign for a scenic lookout coming up in half a mile, a small gravel pull-off perched on the edge of a 500-foot drop. It was a death trap if he pinned me there, but it was also the only place wide enough for me to attempt a maneuver that might break the tether. I began to pump my brakes, not to stop, but to flash my red tail lights as a warning, a deceptive signal that I was giving up and pulling over. As I neared the lookout, I steered the car toward the gravel, feeling the tires lose their grip on the slick stones and the rear of the car fishtail toward the edge. The truck surged forward, smelling blood, its engine screaming as it prepared to block me in against the rusted railing. In that split second, as his massive chrome grille pulled alongside my driver's side door, I saw the driver, a man with a calm, bored expression, holding a heavy iron tire iron in his gloved hand. He wasn't angry. He looked like a butcher at the start of a long shift. He started to turn his wheel to ram me into the ravine, his eyes locking onto mine with a chilling lack of emotion. I didn't pull into the lookout. At the very last microsecond, I slammed my foot on the accelerator and jerked the wheel back toward the main road, the side of my car scraping against his fender with a shower of sparks and the screech of tearing metal. The suddenness of my movement caught him off guard, his heavy truck already carrying too much momentum into the loose gravel of the turnoff. I watched in the mirror as his brake lights flared crimson, the massive vehicle sliding sideways like a breaching whale on the wet stones. The back of the truck clipped the guardrail, the metal snapping like toothpicks, and for one heartbeat, I thought he was going over the edge. He didn't go over, but the front of his truck slammed into a massive pine tree with an impact that sounded like a dry bone snapping, the hood crumpling and steam billowing out into the frozen night air. I didn't stop to help, and I didn't slow down to see if he was crawling out of the wreckage. I drove like a man possessed, my engine whining in protest as I flew down the other side of the mountain toward the lights of a small logging town in the distance. When I finally reached a well-lit gas station, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, shaking so hard I couldn't unbuckle my seatbelt. The side of my car was gouged and raw, a permanent scar from a night where a stranger decided my life was a game. And even now, whenever a pair of high beams appears behind me on a dark road, I feel that same icy hand clutch my heart. The detour sign appeared out of nowhere, a cheap, handwritten cardboard affair tacked to a weathered telephone pole, pointing down a narrow, unpaved road that snaked into a dense forest. I was chasing the sunset along the Pacific Coast Highway, a drive I dreamed of for years, but a sudden rockslide had apparently closed the main route ahead. Construction ahead, local traffic, only detour 2 miles. The sign read, its crude lettering almost swallowed by the fading light. A part of me, the part that trusted intuition, screamed to ignore it and wait for morning. But the gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty, and the promise of a quicker route was too tempting to resist. Besides, there was a beat-up pickup truck with blinking hazard lights parked just past the sign, and 2 men in reflective vests were waving me onward, their figures indistinct in the deepening twilight. I eased my little hatchback onto the gravel, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust that shimmered in my headlights. The road was barely wide enough for one car, hemmed in on both sides by ancient, moss-covered trees that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets into the silence. The air grew heavy and damp, carrying the faint, earthy smell of decay, and the last vestiges of daylight were quickly consumed by the thick canopy overhead. I noticed that the construction workers hadn't actually been doing any work. Their truck looked abandoned, and their gestures had been oddly urgent, almost like they were hurting me. My heart began to thump a little faster, a tiny drumbeat of unease against the growing gloom. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the gravel road opened into a small, dilapidated clearing. A single, flickering fluorescent light illuminated a makeshift gate made of rusty chain-link fence and barbed wire, guarded by a shack that looked like it was pieced together from discarded plywood. There was a second, larger sign here, much more professional than the first, but its message sent a shiver down my spine. Private property, unauthorized entry, strictly forbidden, violators will be prosecuted. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a detour. It was a trap. Before I could even think about reversing, a figure emerged from the shack, a hulking man with a matted beard and eyes that glittered with an unsettling intensity under the brim of a stained baseball cap. He held a heavy-duty flashlight, its beams swinging wildly, temporarily blinding me. He gestured for me to stop, his other hand casually resting on what looked like the stock of a shotgun slung over his shoulder. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a wave of icy dread wash over me. "Evening, ma'am." His voice rasped, surprisingly calm, but laced with an undertone that promised violence. "Looks like you took the wrong turn. We don't get many visitors out this way." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across my windshield, and I noticed the gate was now closed behind me, locked with a heavy padlock. There was no way out. He leaned down, his face inches from my window, and I could smell stale cigarettes and something metallic, like old blood. "Lucky for you," he continued, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, revealing missing teeth. "We're just about to close up for the night. You'll have to wait here with us until morning." He straightened up and motioned toward a spot further inside the clearing, where a few other cars, covered in dust and cobwebs, were parked haphazardly, their windows dark and vacant. They looked like abandoned husks, frozen in time. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, as I realized the true horror of the situation. These weren't stranded vehicles. They were the remains of other victims. My mind raced, trying to find an escape, any way to get out of this remote, isolated hell. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my eyes darting around the clearing, searching for a weakness, a blind spot, anything. The man started to walk toward the gate, jangling a set of keys that glinted wickedly in the faint light. I knew that if he opened that gate, he wasn't going to let me leave. As he moved away, I noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible gap in the barbed wire on the far side of the fence, near an old, rotting shed. It was barely wide enough for a person, let alone a car, but it was a glimmer of hope. I watched him unlock the gate and then start to push it open, his back momentarily turned to me. This was my only chance. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, throwing the car into reverse with a violent jolt that sent my head snapping back against the headrest. The hulking man shouted, whirling around, but it was too late. The hatchback screeched backward, tires spitting gravel, and I angled it precisely toward that gap in the fence. The barbed wire ripped along the passenger side, tearing a long, jagged gash in the metal and shattering the rear passenger window with a deafening crash. I felt shards of glass spray against the back of my head, but I didn't flinch. The engine roared, struggling against the resistance of the fence, the entire car shaking violently as it forced its way through the narrow opening. I could hear gunshots echoing behind me, the sound of bullets pinging off the metal of my car, but I pressed on, my foot glued to the pedal. Finally, with a sickening lurch, the car broke free, careening onto what looked like an abandoned logging trail, even narrower and more overgrown than the detour road. I didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the sounds of shouting and gunfire slowly faded behind me. I drove until the sun began to peek over the distant mountains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, and the logging trail finally merged with a small, deserted country road. My car was a wreck, covered in scratches and dents, the rear window a gaping hole, but I was alive. I had escaped. I pulled over at the first sign of civilization, a dilapidated diner, and sank into a booth, my body trembling uncontrollably. The coffee tasted like salvation, and I vowed never again to trust a handwritten sign or a friendly wave from strangers on a dark, isolated road. The humidity of the Louisiana bayou felt like a wet wool blanket draped over the hood of my car as I pulled into the only illuminated patch of ground for 30 miles. It was a crumbling gas station that looked like it was being slowly reclaimed by the swamp, with ivy strangling the rusted pumps and a neon sign that buzzed with a frantic, dying hum. I shouldn't have stopped, but the fuel light had been glowing a steady, mocking amber for the last 20 minutes, and the thought of being stranded on a road where the cypress trees looked like skeletal hands reaching out of the black water was more than I could bear. I left the engine idling for a moment, looking at the small convenience store attached to the station, where a single figure sat behind a counter of thick, yellowed plexiglass. My dog, a golden retriever named Cooper, whined in the passenger seat, his ears pinned back as he stared intently at the dark tree line behind the building. I stepped out of the car, the air smelling of sulfur and stagnant water, and hurried toward the glass door of the shop. As I entered, a bell chimed with a hollow, tinny sound that seemed to echo for much longer than it should have in such a small space. The man behind the counter was ancient, his skin looking like parched leather stretched over a bird's skull, and he didn't look up as I approached. He was meticulously cleaning a small, sharp piece of metal with a greasy rag, his movements slow and deliberate. I asked for $20 on pump 3, trying to keep my voice from trembling, but he just grunted and gestured toward the card reader with a gnarled finger. While I waited for the transaction to process, I turned to look back at my car through the window, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. A second man, much younger and wearing a heavy canvas coat despite the sweltering heat, was standing right next to my driver's side door. He wasn't looking at the car. He was looking directly at me through the store window, his face devoid of any emotion or warmth. He reached out and placed a hand on the handle of my car door, testing it, his eyes never leaving mine. I spun back to the old man, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told him I needed to get back to my vehicle immediately. I reached for the door handle to exit, but it didn't budge. The heavy electronic bolt had slid home with a click I hadn't even noticed over the buzzing of the neon lights. "Door's stuck," the old man whispered, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. "Safety mechanism. Sometimes it triggers when the humidity gets too high or when the sensors think there's a threat outside." He still wouldn't look at me, his focus entirely on that piece of metal in his hands, which I now realized was a heavy-duty bolt cutter. Outside, the man in the canvas coat had produced a small device from his pocket and was leaning toward the window of my car, where Cooper was now barking frantically, his teeth bared in a way I had never seen before. I began to pound on the thick glass of the door, screaming at the man to get away from my dog and my car, but the glass was reinforced and didn't even vibrate under my fists. The stranger outside looked up at my screaming face and smiled, a slow, horrifying expression that told me he knew exactly how helpless I was behind that locked door. He began to spray something from a small canister into the air intake of my car, a thick, white vapor that I knew would eventually knock Cooper out or worse. I turned back to the old man, pleading with him to hit the release button, offering him my watch, my phone, and every dollar in my wallet, but he just continued his rhythmic cleaning. "He's just collecting the taxes," the old man said, finally looking up with eyes that were clouded by thick, milky cataracts. "The road takes what it's owed, one way or another, and you brought a lot of value into this valley tonight." I realized then that this wasn't a robbery. It was a harvest. I looked around the small shop, my eyes landing on a heavy fire extinguisher mounted near the soda machine. If the door wouldn't open, I would have to make my own exit through the side window, which looked slightly thinner than the front entrance. I grabbed the heavy red cylinder and swung it with every bit of desperation I had left, slamming it against the glass over and over. The sound was deafening in the cramped space, and on the fourth strike, a spiderweb of cracks blossomed across the surface. Behind the counter, the old man finally dropped his rag and reached for something beneath the register, his face twisting into a mask of sudden, sharp anger. I didn't give him the chance to bring whatever it was into view. I threw the fire extinguisher through the weakened glass, the entire pane shattering into thousands of harmless diamonds that rained down onto the muddy ground outside. I scrambled through the jagged frame, the glass tearing at my jeans and the palms of my hands, but I didn't feel the pain. The man in the canvas coat was startled by the explosion of glass and momentarily stepped back from my car, giving me the 2 seconds of space I needed to reach the driver's side. I dived through the open window, thanking God I hadn't rolled it all the way up, and felt my fingers find the keys that were still dangling in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car again, his heavy boots thudding against the metal of the door as he tried to kick his way in. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screaming and spitting gravel and swamp mud in a blinding spray that caught him full in the face. I didn't look back as I shifted into drive and floored it, the car fishtailing wildly before finding traction on the crumbling asphalt of the highway. I drove for 10 miles with the interior light on, one hand on the wheel and the other buried in Cooper's fur, listening to his labored breathing as he recovered from the gas. When I finally saw the blue lights of a state trooper's car parked at a way station, I pulled over and wept, knowing that if I had stayed in that shop for even one more minute, my car would have been just another empty husk rotting in the tall grass of the bayou.